Welcome to A Date with Darkness podcast, where I will be discussing the impact of hurtful and abusive relationships and how to overcome them so that you can move through your pain and get to the kind of healthy relationships you want, need, and deserve. I'm Dr. Natalie Jones. I'm a licensed psychotherapist based in California. While I hope that you find this podcast educational and informational, please note it should not be substituted for treatment with a licensed mental health professional. Also, due to the nature of the podcast, some of the information presented on the show can be sensitive to some of my listeners, so please note that listener discretion is advised. Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm super excited to be chatting with you guys today. I want to definitely put a special disclaimer about sensitive content being discussed on the show today, because today I'm going to take a deeper dive into, sexual abuse of boys and what that looks like as they grow up and become men. So I recognize that may be very sensitive topic to a lot of my listeners out there. I have a lot of men who listen to this show, and I wanted to take some time to do some episodes dedicated to the abuse of men, because I've talked about abuse in general. I've talked about abuse as it relates to women, but the fact of the matter is I do have a lot of male listeners, and I definitely want to take some time out and spread some awareness and appreciation for my male listeners of the show. Um, I one of the jobs that I've had for many years that I don't necessarily or that I haven't necessarily really talked about is a forensic interviewer. Specifically, I have a talent, I guess you could say, of interviewing people who are sexual assault victims, and the talent that I have with respect to that, or the expertise I have with respect to that, I should say, as opposed to talent, is interviewing people that are severely intellectually or cognitively challenged or disabled. So people who have a severe learning or mental disability or cognitive disability. I got my start many years ago when I started interviewing or did an interview with victims of cerebral palsy. And I've done that for many years, I should say, and have done it for court cases and what have you. And I've really enjoyed the work. It's very I don't want to say labor intensive, but emotionally intensive, because it could be so much more challenging to interview people who are disadvantaged in some way, and that are often maybe overlooked or not as understood or inquired, because people aren't really sure how to go about getting an answer. So I should say that's an expertise that I have, and I've it's a skill that I've developed over the years. And in addition to doing that, in addition to interviewing people that are at an intellectual disadvantage, I've also spent many years interviewing men who've been sexually assaulted. As many of you know, I've worked a number of years in corrections. I've worked prior to that for as a contractor for pretrial and probation. Um, so extensive years of working with men, leading groups and doing therapy and, just evaluations and things of that nature. And I've really enjoyed every single person that I've had the pleasure of working with or interviewing, because they all present some unique challenges. And most recently, I've just got done doing some work where I've interviewed a bunch men who were um, sexually assaulted as young boys or children, and just having to talk to them and get information. And so one of the areas and where I want to spend some time talking about today in is talking about, you know, what that looks like, a man who was sexually abused as a young boy, and what that looks like as they come of age and they become men. Because um, I don't think there's enough awareness, and I'm not sure that that's talked about enough. And I want to spread a little bit more awareness and insight as to what that looks like. And one of the things that I will say, or one of the challenges, in talking with men who've been sexually abused, it's very difficult to do. That's a very difficult job to do, and it's not because men are difficult, but a lot of times these are people that have never shared with anybody what's happened to them. So we're talking about many years of kind of holding this secret and then having to tell. And that can be very difficult when you think about someone who's like guarded a secret with their life. And the secret has, like, they've carried it around and it's impacted every aspect of their life. To finally share that with someone, it can be very difficult for them to do, and understandably so. And I want to talk a little bit before I dive into um the interviewing, or just some of the things that have come out from the interview. I want to kind of give you guys some background about abuse of boys and children in general, some statistics, which I don't normally do, but I think it's relevant to this show. I've done extensive research on and written about child abuse and neglect. And I haven't written about it as recently as I did when I was in grad school. In grad school, I was constantly researching and looking at it. And I recently looked at the statistics again just to talk about it a little bit for the show. And sadly, the results of the statistics have not changed, I should say. And so when I looked up the statistics, of course, I go to the Children's Bureau for Child Abuse and Maltreatment, and look up the statistics there. Now, back in I was doing my dissertation back in 2008, 2016, and back during that time when I wrote my dissertation, what I recall, and I didn't go back to look at it for hard facts, but just from what stands out to me, because anybody who's written a dissertation knows that you have to, basically have to memorize it. It's blood, sweat, and tears. You have to do a presentation on it, and it becomes like the thing. And so just because I looked at it and wrote it so much and rewrote it, you have to become somewhat familiar with the research that you're presenting, as well as passionate. And so back then, when I was a young student, and that's back, I'll just say for simplicity's sake, back in 2016 was when it was published. Um, you know, the children that were had the highest incidences of child abuse reports were young Black boys. And young Black boys were were also the most likely to be um, uh, the abuse of Black boys is most likely also to result in fatalities, meaning that I want to make sure I'm wording this correctly, meaning that Black boys had the highest incidences of fatality from child abuse and neglect. And so back when I was looking at it again for this show, the numbers have changed a little bit, but not much, meaning that, now, as opposed to boys being more likely to be victims, the victimization rate for girls is now higher, 8.7 to boys being at a 7.5 per 1,000 children in the population. Right now, children, the demographics of the children that are most likely to be recipients of abuse are likely to be under the age of 1. Natives are currently reported as being the most abused children at the highest rate, and then Black children or African American children are second behind American natives. With that being said, though, African American children in general have the highest rate of fatalities from child abuse and child neglect. And the perpetrator that's most likely to the person who's most likely to perpetrate child abuse and child neglect is also more often than not going to be a parent of that child. And right now, women or mothers are in the lead for being more likely to be the aggressor of child abuse and child neglect. Um, the majority of perpetrators are parents to their victims, and the largest percentages of perpetrators are white at 48%, and then African American at 21%, and then Hispanic at 20.9%. So that's just to give you some factual information there. And I'm going to definitely post a link to the report that this is actually pulled from in the show notes so that you guys can see that and have a look at that. And again, be more aware of what the statistics are saying or what the national reports are saying about child abuse and child neglect. And so just to go ahead and take a dive um, deeper into, just some of the commonalities that I found over the years from interviewing. And for this podcast, I'm going to definitely stick to reporting about men. I've definitely have interviewed both men and women, but just for the purposes of this podcast, I'm going to stick to talking about men who I've interviewed and talked to about their molestation as boys. Okay, so the first thing that I've noticed in interviewing men who have been sexually assaulted as boys are when we've had to talk about circumstances surrounding the sexual assault, just some mental notes that I've made to myself is that it's more likely, I've noticed in my interviewing of them, that young boys are more likely to have much more aggressive sexual assaults towards them. And what that means to me, and I think not to say that not all sexual assault isn't aggressive, but what I've noticed is that just in interviewing boys, that they're more likely to be approached by more than one aggressor at the same time. So meaning that they may, they're in my experience in interviewing them is that they're much more likely to be approached by sexual assault by more than one perpetrator at a time. So they may be assaulted by 2 to 3 male perpetrators at the same time. And so it's much more violent, I should say. So there may be higher incidences of physical violence, more of group efforts to victimize young boys at the same time. When it's much more violence, that's the higher rate of violence much likely leads to them being more apt to be silent because there's a lot more fear that's involved when their rape is much more violent, and when there's much more fear involved and they're much more likely to stay silent, they're more likely to be repeatedly assaulted over time. And so it's much likely to go on longer because it's violent and there's a lot more fear surrounding what would happen if they say something or what's going to happen to them in general. Okay. And then number two is most of the boys or men that I've interviewed have known their aggressor. And what I know, just because I've worked from both ends of people who have been aggressors or predatory and victims, is what I've noticed is that with predators or aggressors of sexual assault towards their victims, they tend to pick out people that are much more prone to being vulnerable. So they are looking at, uh, which boys don't may be raised by a single parent, or their parent works a lot, or their parent can't pick them up, or they're not readily available, or they may not have a stable home life. So they specifically target people that they know that they're going to be left in a vulnerable position, meaning without supervision of a constant supervision of an adult, typically. It's not always the case, but typically, or they may wait to approach them in situations where their parent may not be involved. Um, and so that's the thing that stands out here for me. Just so that you're aware, is that aggressors are usually fixated on someone, and they target them when they are most vulnerable, and typically that is when they're without a parent or a guardian, or they may come from a disadvantaged home, or a home when there's without or from a place where they know that they won't have any supervision, or parents may be away, or something to that effect. So boys are less likely to tell a parent or anyone what has happened. So they're much more likely to sort of carry that on. There's a lot of shame um, based thinking and feelings around this, like, oh, did I do something that I wasn't supposed to? I'm going to get in trouble if I tell somebody. And that could be from just their own anxiety, or they can also have a parent that's very authoritarian and that is discipline heavy. And so they think that if they have someone, their guardian is already very disciplined, or very just firm and rigid, they're less likely to disclose what has happened. On the flip side, um, there have been men that I've interviewed that have told their parents, and they've been abused even further by their parents. So their parents did actually take it out on them, and did become physically aggressive. So for example, I've interviewed people that have had, quote unquote, like the shit kicked out of them, when their parents found out, or when their father typically maybe found out that this has happened. And so they actually blamed them as a victim, and took out their frustrations and anger and everything else on them. And so when that happened, they're less likely to actually reveal or even talk about with anyone else ever again, for fear that this is going to happen, or that I'm going to be blamed even more, or that my sexuality would be questioned, or that I'm going to get in trouble. In fact, in just about every interview that I've had to do in like corrections or something like that, um, where men, in corrections, we have the Prison Rape Elimination Act. And so there's like a specific protocol that we have to go through anytime we interview um, people who've been sexually assaulted in prison. But in any case, anytime I've ever had to interview people in that, or in a custody type of situation, or that are involved in the criminal justice system, I always have to preface this interview with saying, you're not going to be in any trouble if you tell me what happened. Right. Because they're not going to say anything, because there is still that fear of holding on, that like, oh, if I say that something's happened to me, or if someone did something inappropriate to me, that I'm going to get in trouble, and this is going to end up much worse for me. And I always have to preface it with, you're not going to be in any trouble. And I understand that this is hard. And, I kind of go through this whole thing before I get them to talk about it. But I always always have to start it out with, you're not going to be in any trouble. And I oftentimes have to say that several times throughout the interview. So just as an FYI there. Um, Boys who've experienced sexual assault are much more likely to internalize that victimization, as I've said before. And what that may look like in real time is that oftentimes that may manifest itself in terms of anger. Right, because they haven't told anybody, they don't have an outlet, they don't feel safe, especially if they've been victimized repeatedly, aggressively, violently, as I said before. And so oftentimes that may turn into internalized and externalized anger, right? Anger and aggressiveness. And so what that manifests in terms of real life, what that's going to look like are people who maybe much more involved in fighting, right? So they may become more physically aggressive and fight more. And that may be fighting in school, that may be fighting with themselves. So a lot of times in there are, I would say there, in terms of the men that I've worked with in corrections and prison and so forth, there's a high rate. I would say just about mm, pretty much 100%, for lack of just like, um, just being able to put an exact number, but just about every man, if not every man, that I worked with in prison, has a high rate of self-destructiveness. People that are, what are diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, there's a high rate of self-destruction, and that may manifest in terms of behaviors that are cutting or self-harm. So cutting, burning, hitting themselves, biting themselves, or physically, like trying to physically injuring themselves in some way, or even doing drug use and things like that, things that are high risk. If they're not incarcerated, it may high risk behavior may be things like driving quickly, right, or doing things that are daredevils incidences, things that may have a high fatality rate. And a lot of times there is a high rate of suicidality or suicidal related behaviors, because they have their foot over the line of self-destructiveness, and that looks like someone who doesn't really care if they crash and burn. They feel like they have nothing to lose. And so there is that sort of aggressiveness even towards themselves. They may, next, that person may tend to isolate themselves, so they may tend to spend a lot of times by themselves, and they put distance between themselves and other people. One, because they don't trust people, or they've internalized a message that people are not good to me, people are not safe, and so I need to spend time by myself, or people are upsetting. They also have a high incidence of depression, typically when you isolate, and this can also manifest in relationships with other people when they become older, meaning that, there may be a lot of discord, or fighting, or just emotionally shutting down in relationships where they have significant others, or self-sabotage in their relationships as an adult man in a relationship, or inability to talk about their feelings, and just sort of keeping their distance, or even walking away from relationships a lot of times is what they may tend to do. And a lot of times there's a lot of unanswered questions in terms of, why is the man that I'm with acting this way? And if there are some, in if there's a lot of big question marks, it could be related to a person being a victim of sexual assault, a man being a victim of sexual assault. There can also be symptoms and signs of paranoia with respect to people, meaning that, okay, I don't trust people. And then when I'm in a situation where there are a bunch of people around me, like if I have to go out into a crowded situation, I'm feeling much more paranoid about these people around me, people who get too close to me. I don't like that. So I need space from that, space from people. And that also may be targeted more towards their perpetrator, which were a lot of the men that I've interviewed have been other men. So it's very interesting to see, even in corrections. When I've worked, there are men that are like, "No, I don't want to be around other men because those men are predatory and I don't like it." And it creates a fair amount of anxiety, and paranoia. And also how that paranoia manifests, in terms of an adults, and I've interviewed people where they may just start doing behaviors that don't make sense, and they can't even really explain it to you, why they're doing certain behaviors. So some behaviors that I've seen that have been very concerning are people who may just start carrying weapons, so that the weapons may be guns, daggers, and things like that, just like they've just started carrying weapons and they're prepared, at any time in case anything goes wrong. And they can't explain why there's maybe a sudden shift, but it may be something that, they feel like, I don't ever leave a house without a weapon. I don't even drive without a weapon, or things like that. Or, they may be super watchful and hyper vigilant, of other people, like, or they may be easily triggered, like, I don't like this person, or I see something in this person that sort of reminds me of a perpetrator. And along with that sort of hypervigilance, with the men that I've interviewed, that hypervigilance can also extend to children. So they may be really watchful of children. So, if they have children or if they have grandchildren, they may be super duper protective of them and watchful of them. And they may be triggered by someone speaking harshly to a child, or someone touching a child, or, if they feel like another adult person is being aggressive with a child, they may tend to act out towards that person and become violently aggressive with them, as they don't put your hands, or, just try to um diffuse what they view in their mind as being an abusive situation. So they become very hyper vigilant, and watchful of children. And this may manifest in terms of watching children at sporting activities or extracurricular activities, or they're super watchful, and they may be quick to anger when they feel like a child is being treated unfairly, or touched physically, or they may, they perceive that a child is being abused in some way. Whether or not it's actually happening may be a different story, but if they perceive that, then they're going to be triggered by that, and they're going to react based on that. Um, Going back to the self destructive behavior, men who have been sexually assaulted as boys, again, going back to that self-destructiveness, are highly likely to engage in drinking and drug use. And again, I've talked about the recklessness of behavior, or the self-destructive behavior. And this is important, because especially if you're thinking about what I said about the higher rate of victimization with Black men and Black boys, that is much more likely to result in the pipeline to prison. So you're going to see people that, young men, or young boys that may engage in this, and they all of a sudden they're on the fast track to incarceration or prison. And there is an insanely high rate of men who are incarcerated, who are victims of sexual assault and child abuse and maltreatment, in prison. And it's almost like you can map it along the way. You could see how it sort of manifests out, and where these young boys, they became victims, and then all of a sudden they begin to lash out or act out because they didn't know how to manage these emotions, or they felt like it wasn't safe to manage their emotions and talk to someone or get help. And it things just started to escalate from there. Next thing you know, they are in prison. And going back to the paranoia of carrying weapons, there are a lot of people who become very paranoid and who have been abused, and I can't tell you how many men I've worked with in prison who just have become paranoid. And again, whether or not their paranoia is substantiated or not, but they've just sort of reacted on their paranoia around being around someone who they perceive to be a threat, and then acted on it and shot or stabbed somebody. There is a high prevalence rate of that, and almost always, these men have been victims of sexual assault, where they've committed a murder, or they've committed a violent act against somebody that may or may not have warranted that in their mind. Um, and they've oftentimes have been a victim of sexual assault, and it's because that if they perceive you to be violent, they're going to be impulsive, and it's going to be me against you. And if it's going to be me against you, it's definitely going to be you, because it damn sure isn't going to be me, type of mentality. And so that's kind of what you see there. The last thing that I'll talk about here is around sexuality. Uh, a lot of the men that I've interviewed, all the men that I've interviewed that have been sexually assaulted, question their sexuality, when they've been sexually assaulted. And this manifests in a number of different ways as an adult. And I'll go over a few of the different ways that it manifests here. Is you have men that one and I'm not going to go into detail about everything, but just some of the more common ones that I've seen. You have men that they become very confused about what happened, and they internalize shame. They may blame themselves, for being a victim of sexual violence, and as such, they may question whether or not they did something to sort of bring that on or garner that sort of attention towards them. And so they may question, down the road, am I homosexual or not? I don't know if this means that I'm gay now. And so they may want to distance themselves from the idea that they may be gay, or that they may have liked it in some way, like the sexual assault. It also becomes very confusing to men who've been raped or sexually assaulted if they've had an orgasm during the assault. That triggers a deeper wounding spiritually for them, in terms of, whether or not they're gay or not. Well, if I had an orgasm, during a violent act or something that I didn't enjoy, then that must mean that I liked it, right? And that's not necessarily true, because, as you know, orgasms don't mean that anytime you have an orgasm, it doesn't necessarily mean that you liked it or that you wanted it, and or that you enjoyed what was happening, right? And that could just be a physiological response, and can be a response to fear. Um, but, so there is a wounding around questioning around that. And so wanting to distance themselves away from that. So that could be hypersexual, with women, to try to, again, prove to themselves that they're not in some way, and sort of reaffirm that belief. Women pornography can also play into this, unrealistic expectations around sex, and just sort of trying to prove to themselves that they're not, or also being addicted to feelings of gratification around them not identifying as being homosexual. Number two, they may also have rape-based fantasies. And this isn't something that's very talked about, but Quandra Schaefer's and I talked about this when we um, when she and I did an interview, a little while back. I'll try to link that as well. But we did an interview on sexual assault victims. But this isn't something this is talked about with men, but men also may have rape based fantasies as well, or they may be stuck. Um, you get stuck um, at the age of your trauma. Cognitively, you get stuck at the age of your trauma, right? And so um, that may, when you get stuck the age of your trauma, especially when it comes to sexual assault, there may be ways in which people do try to recreate some of the characteristics around the sexual assault because of the neurological programming that sort of goes into that. When there is a trauma around sex, they the victim of that trauma may be looking to recreate certain elements around that traumatic experience, and it becomes gratifying to them in such a way. And so they may reincorporate certain elements of that trauma um, back into their sex lives. Certain men also, thirdly, there are some men who may withdraw and disconnect from sex altogether. Fourthly, there are men who have experienced sexual assault or sexual violence, who then also become predatory themselves. So it's not uncommon, and I'm not saying this is with all or the majority of cases, but there are a number of men that whom I've interviewed over the years who, you know, may have become um, child sex offenders against children who have also experienced sexual violence as a child as well. And so they recreate that trauma using that experience with someone else. And it's not always the case that a child sex offender has been sexually assaulted. And it is not always the case that a man who is raped as a boy will become a child sex offender. So I definitely want to put that disclaimer out there. But there is um more, there's just in the men that I've interviewed over the years, there that outcome has been part of it as well. And lastly, what I'll say is it relates to the sexuality piece in is with respect to the homosexuality. There are men that become what you guys know or may refer to as homophobic. And so they may be, if they have an adverse reaction to alternative lifestyles or gay men, they may become highly reactionary to when they see levels of affection expressed between two men, or to the idea of two men loving each other, being with each other in that way. They become highly averse to it. They don't want to see it, they don't like it, and it really turns them off or it pisses them off. And it could be even something as small as seeing that on television, which becomes very, very triggering for them. It may even, if it results in if it results in them having a child that choose a gay or same gender loving lifestyle, um, they may disown their child because that has become such a trigger for them, and they're not able to sort of put that on the back burner. And again, I'm not saying that that every person who is averse to gay or same gender loving relationships has been sexually assaulted. I'm just saying that these are some of the, common traits that I've noticed in people who have experienced that, that they don't want to see that, or, just seeing that men being affectionate towards other men or touching men becomes very triggering for them as a man, and they want to distance themselves away from that. Um, so, um, So these are some of the things that I've noticed around, men that I've interviewed over the years, and I hope that this has been helpful in terms of laying this out. Now, if you are a man who's listening to the show, or if you know of a man that could benefit from listening to the show and who has experienced this, I do want you to know that, if you were a victim of sexual assault, number one, you didn't deserve this. Number two, there is help out there. And a lot of times, even when I interview men, that have gone through this, I have to reiterate, you deserve to have a better quality of life. And, this doesn't need to rule your life anymore. This secret or this shame around what happened to you, it doesn't need to rule your life anymore, and it should not. And so I would encourage you to definitely talk with somebody about what has happened to you, and talk with a professional therapist about what's happened to you when and if you do feel ready. And a lot of times, this is another thing that I'll mention, is that sometimes people may be in therapy already, men may already be in therapy, but um, this is what I'll say. To men who've been sexually assaulted, who've been in therapy, and sometimes they may have been in and out of therapy for years, and they present what I like to call a red herring, right? And there's clinicians or clinical treatment teams that may get caught up in treating a red herring, and it's everything but the sexual assault, right? And this could be a person that just kind of shows up to, I'm depressed, or I may have anxiety, or I may have these things, or I may have a drinking problem, I may have all of these other things, but really what it's manifesting from is a childhood sexual assault. And so there's people that may have spent time talking about everything but that. And that may be the reason for some of the things that maybe the reason for some of these other external factors that manifest for that. And so that's what one thing I'd like to point out. So, just if and when you do get ready and get to a place of sort of, talking about it, um, you definitely want to share that with a licensed mental health person. There are resources out there. RAINN.org, RAINN.org is a website that's dedicated to talking about sexual assault, and you can review that. Um, you know, and and but I would definitely encourage, if and when you're ready to seek out professional help around that. There are books and things of that nature, and so I'll post some of the resources here in the show notes. But I hope that this has been helpful, and I'm going to post additional episodes as it relates to abuse of men. Um, I'm going to definitely make this a series. And it won't necessarily revolve around sexual assault, but just talking about abuse of men and how that manifests and what that looks like, and some of the support that you need around that. But I want you to remember to be kind to yourselves. And part of being kind is relieving yourself from the blame. Like, it's never okay for an adult to take advantage of a child. um it's never okay for that to happen. And you didn't do anything to deserve that. And you deserve to be in your own body, be in your own skin, and feel safe without people taking advantage of that. Okay. And so I hope that this has been helpful. And, I want you to know that, emotions like anger, frustration, um, are normal and understood given the gravity of what you've experienced. But there's constructive versus destructive ways to express those. And, talking with a mental health professional can let you know of ways that are much more constructive to talk about and let out your anger and your frustration around what was done to you. And I think that that is, what's necessary, because being victimized does make you angry, and it should make you angry. But there are ways in which you could sort of release that and acknowledge those feelings in a safer, kinder, much more self compassionate way. All right. So that's what I have for you guys today. I hope that this has been helpful. And um, sometimes I get these ideas for shows that are creatively on my brain, or maybe it might be what my work consists of at the moment. And so I have to kind of let these things out when they strike for me, because that's what benefits me, or that's kind of what's on my heart at the time. So I hope that you found some nuggets from it. And for those of you who are listening, who are parents, and that know, or your parents, or your aunt and uncles, or godparents, or your friends of people with kids, be mindful of children, protect children, um, hold them a little tighter, invite conversations, allow children to feel safe to come to you and talk to you and tell you when things are not okay. Express to your children that they have autonomy over their body and over their mental health, right? And let them know that it's okay for them to say no. It's okay for them to tell you when someone is not being appropriate with them. So invite them to have those conversations. If someone has touched them inappropriately, and would they feel safe to come to you and talk to you, and and most importantly, let them know that if that were to ever happen, they wouldn't be in any trouble. So until next time, you guys take care of yourselves and be well.